The characteristics of fascism: anti-liberal, anti-democratic. The previous section expounded upon fascism's inherent totalitarianism. However, there are several aspects of this totalitarianism that help to inform other aspects of fascist ideology and as a result deserve to be expanded upon. Fascism was an inherently anti-liberal and anti-democracy. While technically these are two separate topics, they are so inextricably linked that discussing one without the other is difficult. Further, the fascists saw the two as being inextricably linked. Alfredo Rocco writes that, quote, "Logically developed, liberalism leads to democracy, for democracy contains the promises of liberalism," unquote. Further, the fascist antipathy towards liberalism and democracy connects directly to their antipathy towards communism and Marxism. Rocco continues, writing, quote, "Logically developed, liberalism leads to democracy. The logical development of democracy issues into socialism," unquote. This hostility to communism and Marxism has been discussed previously and will be expanded upon later in these videos. For now, however, it is worthwhile to focus upon fascism's inherent antipathy to liberalism and democracy. Before one can continue to discuss the ideas of liberalism in contradistinction to the ideas of fascism, one must define one's terms. According to the Oxford Dictionary, liberalism is defined as, quote, 1. Willingness to respect or accept behavior or opinions different from one's own, openness to new ideas. 2. A political and social philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise," unquote. It ought to be further noted that the term liberalism has a historical context, a 19th century context that has already been discussed at length earlier in these videos. Some of the key tenets of liberalism were, quote, advocating private property, an unhampered market economy, the rule of law, constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion and of the press, and international peace based on free trade, unquote. Against these ideas, fascism declared an undying war. Mussolini wrote, quote, "In the face of liberal doctrines, fascism takes up an attitude of absolute opposition, both in the field of politics and in that of economics," unquote. Fascism's distaste for liberalism was multifaceted. For one, fascism abhorred liberalism's laissez-faire attitude towards society. Such an attitude stood opposed to the totalitarianism that fascism wished to achieve. Rocco writes that, quote, "Liberals insist that the best manner to secure the welfare of the citizens as individuals is to interfere as little as possible with the free development of their activities," unquote. As was discussed in the previous video, this idea of society is nonsensical to the fascists. For the fascists, there is no such thing as civil society. Every aspect of life in a holistic community is political. This kind of live and let live attitude leads to social disintegration and the collapse of societies as entities with historical continuities. Rocco continues, quote, "For liberalism, society has no purpose other than those of the members living at a given moment. For fascism, society has historical and imminent ends of preservation, expansion, improvement, quite distinct from those of individuals which at a given moment compose it. So distinct, in fact, that they may even be in opposition," unquote. Liberalism represented an inherent selfishness and overemphasis upon individuality, so much so that it would lead to the destruction of society as a whole. Rocco identifies this sense of individualism as atomism and draws a direct connection between liberalism and the communist enemy the fascists had sworn blood oaths against. Rocco writes, quote, "The common basis of all these doctrines, which stretch from Longuet to Buchanan and from Althusser down to Karl Marx to Wilson and to Lenin, is a social and state concept which I shall call mechanical or atomistic. Society, according to this concept, is merely a sum total of individuals, a plurality which breaks up into its single components. Therefore, the ends of a society so considered are nothing more than the ends of the individuals which compose it and for whose sake it exists." Unquote. Another reason for fascism's opposition to liberalism was the sense that it was an outdated ideology when taking into account modernity. Fascists were not alone in this sentiment. Radicals around the world saw themselves as driving forward while the liberals held the world back. Central planning was the wave of the future. Laissez-faire belonged in the dustbin of history. American journalist Lincoln Steffens wrote of Petrograd in 1919, quote, "I have seen the future, and it works," unquote. While Steffens was writing specifically of the communist revolution in Russia, his anti-liberal sentiment was common throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Mussolini in 1932 made the claim that the 19th century had been the century of liberalism and democracy, and he predicted that the 20th century would be the century of fascism. According to the fascists, the future belonged to them. Another aspect of why fascism rejected liberalism was because of their belief that liberalism's weakness and permissiveness had allowed for the creation of decadent societies that invariably led to, quote, "unnatural," unquote, political developments like Marxism and communism. Rocco writes that, quote, "modern political thought remained until recently under the absolute control of those doctrines which were firmly grounded in the institutions and customs of the English, of the American, and of the French revolutions," unquote. The traditions he is referring to are largely considered to be of liberal origins, particularly when one considers the roots of the French and American revolutions. According to the fascists, liberalism invariably will lead to international communism, resulting in the destruction of distinct nationalist identities and communities, the destruction of Germany and Italy and Japan. Such a fate must be avoided at all costs. Finally, fascism abhorred liberalism because as an ideology it had built up modern conceptions of democracy that, according to the fascists, had led to widespread corruption, social disintegration, and the rise of Marxism and communism. Hitler wrote extensively about what he perceived to be corruption in the democratic system of the Weimar Republic. In Mein Kampf, Hitler has a long diatribe wherein he attacks the dishonest and manipulative nature of party politicians. He calls them, quote, "parliamentary jugglers," unquote, and stargazers, and claims that they utilize the people for their own personal and political gain. He describes the politicians as cart drivers, whose motivation is to prevent the people from, quote, "slipping out of the harness of the old party cart," unquote. The politicians do not care for the actual needs of the people. Politicians consistently promise to enact sweeping changes in exchange for votes, and yet do nothing. Further, the politicians only feign to care about the needs of the people when an election is near. Otherwise, it is merely business as usual. A continuation of the status quo that benefits them. Not only does Hitler criticize these politicians, he also criticizes the set of special interest groups who are in bed with the politicians and help them into office, in exchange for robbing the public purse for their own gain. The people, all the while, are treated as dumb animals, whose trust and hopes are manipulated, exploited, but ultimately ignored. Hitler ends this long diatribe with this summary, quote, "The whole political struggle actually consists in nothing but a mad rush for seats in Parliament in which convictions and principles are thrown overboard like sand ballast whenever it seems expedient," unquote. According to Hitler, all of this corruption, lying, fraud, bribery, and extortion are all a natural consequence of democracy run amok. Democracy is nothing more than a cracked facade, barely concealing the rotten face of a charlatan. Hitler likewise echoes the argument that democracy will inevitably lead to the ascendancy of communism and Marxism. The Marxists will use democracy to sweep into power and then establish a dictatorship. Hitler writes, quote, "Though at present a part of the Marxists shrewdly try to pretend that they are inseparably linked with the principles of democracy, do not forget, if you please, that in the critical hour these gentlemen didn't care a damn about a majority decision in the Western democratic sense, unquote. Hitler continues in his diatribe, quote, "The Marxists will march with democracy until they succeed in indirectly obtaining for their criminal aims the support of even the national intellectual world destined by them for extermination," unquote. Hitler in these passages is arguing that the Marxists would hijack democracy and use it for their own purposes, and, once gaining victory, would ultimately pull the rug out from under the people that voted for them and establish a dictatorship. A page later in Mein Kampf, Hitler continues to paint this bleak image of communism in the ascendancy. Hitler writes, quote, "The banner bearers of the Red International would then, instead of addressing an appeal to the democratic conscience, emit a fiery call to the proletarian masses, and their struggle at one stroke would be removed from the stuffy air of our parliamentary meeting halls to the factories and the streets. Democracy would be done for immediately. Proletarian masses would instantly succeed in doing as in the fall of 1918. They would drive it home to the bourgeois world how insane it is to imagine that they can oppose Jewish world domination with the methods of Western democracy," unquote. In this passage, Hitler is making the argument that not only is Western democracy unable to protect itself from the onrushing communist horde, by its nature it enables the communists to take over. Further, he connects his attacks on communism, liberalism, and democracy all together under the umbrella of his anti-Semitic obsession. For Hitler and the Nazis, communism was the product of an international Jewish conspiracy to destroy the Aryan race, and democracy and liberalism directly enable this conspiracy to continue. Ergo, according to the Nazis, in order to defend the Aryan race, democracy and liberalism must be abolished. Similarly, Franco had been concerned that the Spanish Republic would lead to communists seizing power and destroying the Catholic Church. A month before the fascists launched the Civil War, groups of anarchists and socialists burned churches and assaulted hundreds of people, killing upwards of 200 people amidst a series of labor strikes. Many of the fascists believed that, quote, "Spain was becoming ungovernable," unquote, and, quote, "Calvo Sotelo warns that patriotic soldiers would save Spain from anarchy," unquote. The fascists believed that the Spanish Republic had enabled radicals to wreak havoc on the country and endanger the Catholic Church. Here again, one sees the fascist belief that democracy and liberalism inevitably lead to communism. The Japanese militarists likewise challenged the premises of democracy. In part, Kita Ikki challenged the idea that everyone's vote ought to be equal. When it comes to technical issues, Ikki asks, why should a nation hold in equal the opinions of experts and laymen? Ikki writes, quote, "It cannot be said that in debating a bill on naval expansion, one vote of Admiral Togo, the hero of the 1905 Battle of Tsushima Straits, is not worth more than the 3 votes of the disgraceful Diet members. The effect of giving an absolute value to the present form of a government elected by votes ignores those people that have value and is nothing but support for the old order," unquote. In this passage, not only is Ikki challenging the idea of universal suffrage, he is also disparaging the characters of the politicians and the Diet. And he is making the claim that democracy itself helps to preserve the old order. Ikki is making the claim here that democracy throws wrenches into the process of instituting needed reforms. Furthermore, the Japanese militarist opposition to democracy was connected to the veneration of the emperor, as well as a cultural emphasis upon social hierarchies. Elsewhere in these videos, Ikki alleges that democracy goes against, quote, "the Japanese spirit," unquote, particularly when politicians act with insincerity in attempting to corral voters to support them. Ikki writes, quote, A system where the head of state has to manipulate views by selling his name, refining his mannerisms like a low-class actor to fight elections, is for the Japanese race who have been brought up to believe that silence is golden and modesty a virtue, invitation enough to remain a mute spectator to this strange custom." Unquote. Democracy goes against long-held Japanese virtues and values, according to this. Connected to these allegations of corruption and fraud, the fascists often alleged that democracy was fundamentally an inefficient system of government. When crises arise, democracies are notoriously incompetent, particularly when it comes to responding to the crisis in a timely fashion. When the nation and the people are suffering or are in danger, one cannot waste time deliberating. One must take action. This idea of action will be expanded upon in a later video. Suffice it to say here that the fascist cult of action was a key part as to why they rejected democracy. An irony can be seen in these fears of communists using democracy to seize power and establish a dictatorship, is that in order to prevent a communist dictatorship, the fascists needed to seize power using democracy and establish their own dictatorship. A further irony of these anti-democratic sentiments is that the fascists participated in the democratic systems before they seized full control. As was noted earlier in the populism video, the Nazis, the Italian fascists, and the Japanese militarists all had electoral successes. The irony of this is palpable when one considers Goebbels' comment upon electoral victory in 1928, when the Nazis won 12 seats in the Reichstag. Goebbels declared, quote, "We have nothing to do with the parliament. We reject it from within," unquote. They democratically won the seats in order to denounce democracy itself. A third irony arises. Although the fascists were philosophically opposed to democracy, they nevertheless made the claim that they were democratic. Mussolini claimed that fascism was, quote, "the purest form of democracy," unquote. Mussolini further went on to claim that, quote, "if democracy means not to relegate to the people to the periphery of the state, then fascism could be defined as organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy," unquote. In Japan, Keita Ikki likewise challenges the idea that Western-style democracy was actually following true democratic ideals. Ikki writes, quote, "To regard an assembly or constitution as an absolute ideal is to accept a literal translation of a hallowed idea of Western democracy. Those who think in this way are obdurate conservatives hiding the real principles of democracy," unquote. Gentili echoed similar sentiments when he wrote, quote, "The fascist corporative state supplies a representative system more sincere and more in touch with the realities than any other previously devised and is therefore freer than the old liberal state," unquote. According to Gentili, not only did fascism represent the will of the people, but it did so in a far more authentic and effective way than democracy or liberalism ever had. This sense relates directly back to fascism's inherent populism.